It's been a long time coming, but I finally accepted a hard truth. We will never see traditional dungeons in a Zelda game again. Though unbelievably tragic, we're not here to lament. In fact, it should come as no surprise, as Zelda dungeons have continually evolved well beyond their first iteration. So let's talk about how dungeons have changed, why the traditional dungeons went the way of the Guardians, where we're at now, and what future dungeon design could be. Zelda 1 and 2's labyrinths and palaces feel like literal mazes, full of dead ends and disorientingly branching paths, with the goal being merely to survive the plethora of insane combat scenarios in an effort to beat the boss and hightail it out of there until the stakes are raised in the subsequent dungeon. Get rinsed, be washed, repeat. As you continually progressed, the levels themselves changed color and grew to unwieldy sizes. Enemies got stronger and more varied, and the rooms in which they occurred tilted more heavily against you. This was the extent of their puzzles. I broadly describe these dungeons as how do I survive dungeons. The series' third game, A Link to the Past, further developed the dungeon concept, making them much more heavily puzzle-focused, which Link's Awakening reinforced, while also designing their layouts around their names to mixed success. It's here we find the earliest examples of what would later come to be described as traditional dungeons, and what would be the staple of every top-down and 3D game from Ocarina of Time to Skyward Sword. To me, traditional dungeons follow this two-act structure. First, you enter the dungeon to find many paths blocked by some mechanic you've yet to obtain. As you complete the obstacles you're able to, you eventually come to the hinge between the first and second act. A mid-boss, which once defeated, grants you a new item which opens up or recontextualizes the dungeon. Completing these obstacles gets you to the final boss, who is generally defeated using that same dungeon item, and so on and so forth. Progressing through a dungeon feels like loosening a thread until eventually the whole knot is unraveled and the dungeon is complete. I broadly describe these dungeons as how do I escape dungeons. While this structure remains largely unchanged, there was a certain magic in anticipating which dungeons would yield which items and how these items would be used to conquer their respective dungeons. Moreover, the dungeons themselves also offered a variety of styles and how they were actually navigated, as described elsewhere as either gauntlet, lock and key, or puzzle box. Again, while their structure remained largely unchanged, the mix of these styles allowed players to alternate their thinking when presented with a multitude of dungeon types within a single game. Ultimately, the persistence of traditional dungeons is a testament to the quality of their design. But this too must pass. A Link Between Worlds was the first to crack this structure, allowing the player to purchase items prior to entering their respective dungeons. But even with this traditional hinge remove, they still resembled the more traditional affairs. Then came the rethinking of conventions, and with it, divine beasts, for which Breath of the Wild has long been famous or infamous. In concept, they are pretty interesting. A volume existing in the overworld that contains specific puzzles, a portion of which the player can manipulate in real time to traverse the beast and complete puzzles, even if this mechanic isn't immediately clear when the first divine beast is encountered. Criticisms of both era of the Wild's dungeons have been beaten to a gluey pulp, so I won't belabor them here. I will make three brief generalizations. The first is that their dungeon formulas are the same, aesthetics notwithstanding. Find the 4 or 5 terminals to unlock the boss fight. Not very intriguing, even when finding the terminals is altered to collecting construct pieces. The second is that because there is no item-based progression, these dungeons could all be a player's first dungeon, and as such, don't have much in the way of progressive difficulty, or accumulated knowledge that can be applied to puzzle solving. They can't build on previous concepts. The exception I see most often is Hyrule Castle from Breath of the Wild, but please tell me what you liked about it, because I seem to recall it being unexceptional when I played through it 8 years ago. And 3, they are essentially optional. However, Echoes of Wisdom gave us a brief glimpse into what the future might hold. Perhaps its best addition was Dungeon Tiers. It allowed the player to choose a subset of dungeons, complete a mandatory one, and then choose another subset. This type of sequencing allows for checks in the player's progression without completely stamping out freedom of choice, which serves as a nice middle ground while also allowing the story to more naturally unfold. Dungeons also play with the idea of being in an enclosed space that you can maneuver within and without, similar to the era of the Wild's dungeons, having the player weave through interior and exterior entrances. But while they contain locked doors, chests with keys, and puzzles that have multiple solutions, my biggest complaint is that they never really iterate or elaborate on their concepts. Some dungeons have a multitude of simple puzzles obscuring their central concept, while others have a clear concept that just as it's getting good, leads to the end of the dungeon. In this way, they all feel too basic, too simple, and to my dismay, unchallenging. Woe is me. I detail all this because a growing criticism levied against these new games is the need for a multitude of intricate, expansive, traditional dungeons in the open world format. I agree with a majority of that sentiment, but as I said, I don't believe the 2-act traditional dungeons are coming back because Zelda games no longer dole out items traditionally, instead giving the player whatever is necessary from the outset. Regardless, I think a new iteration of dungeons can exist without sacrificing the openness of the overworld and the mechanics on which it's built. So what does the future hold? First, I'd like to set some ground rules. The overworld will contain no shrines, not in the familiar sense. Instead, simple puzzles will exist directly within the overworld, no load screens. Solutions will remain varied and will be physically and chemically based, with a focus similar to shrines and what I call intuitive puzzle solving. Balls roll downhill, heavy things weigh down lighter things, buoyant objects float, wind turns a fan, cold freezes water, etc. By mimicking the real world, we intuit how these systems will function in the digital world. The parameters of the problem become immediately clear. I consider this a great strength of the era of the Wilds games. Additionally, similar, simple puzzles will cluster in particular regions, so that completing a region's puzzles familiarizes the player with the potential implementation or manipulation of those physics within that portion of the world and gives a glimpse of what the puzzles within that region's dungeon may look like. As for the dungeons themselves, there are a few broad guidelines I think they should follow. First, to me, what's more interesting than freedom is variety. A mix of gauntlet, lock and key, puzzle box, and yes, open air dungeons. A single game with a variety of these dungeon types would not only challenge players' navigation within dungeons, but also around them. And not only that, give us large dungeons and mini dungeons. Second, give them to us in tiers. This serves both to keep the story moving, but also again to check the player's progress. Each dungeon in the first tier could house a set of interconnected puzzles that tests a particular aspect of the world's physics, chemistry, or the interaction of the two, with puzzles that build up to give the player an understanding of how they work that will both lead to conquering the dungeon and more readily exploring the overworld. Then the next dungeon tier can either ramp up the difficulty of these puzzles or combine the different physics or dungeon types in order for the player to re-evaluate exactly how they thought puzzles would work. For instance, if the Zelda team still gives Link all his abilities at the beginning, let early dungeons push the basic implementation of those abilities to their limit. Test the player's knowledge of the system. Conquering the dungeons can then give interesting rewards that change how you navigate the overworld or combat. Then, in the next tier, guide the player to discover that these basic abilities have more utility. If a power allows you to make blocks, let the next dungeon tier use it as a hammer. If a power is used like a hookshot, let a later dungeon use it while Link is stationary so that he can manipulate whatever he's grappled to, etc. This recontextualizes Link's abilities in a way that still makes them seem novel even though you get them early on in the game. Having knowledge of their additional uses could change how you see the overworld when replaying. These could also be used in combination with the rewards given in the first tier of dungeons. And I've made this point before, but given a specific game's mechanics, there can also be a magical type of physics, one that follows in-game rules that don't correlate to the real world. Link has a moon power that allows him to control tides or something. An entire dungeon could be centered around understanding this new or magic physics in addition to the others. Ideally, this would become as intuitive as shooting an eye or a switch, although I hope the puzzles are better. Third, ground them in the world, literally and figuratively. Make them feel like they belong in a particular region, or are useful to the characters near them. Allow their histories, themes, and design to connect to the broader story to reflect the themes of the game. Anytime a dungeon is connected to lore, that only makes them more interesting. Finally, give us a lot of them, spread through each tier. In the original Legend of Zelda, there are 9 dungeons, and many orders to do them in, although, contrary to popular belief, you can't do them in any order. Part of their charm is that there is so much choice simply because there are so many dungeons. But they were also mandatory. You had to complete all 8 before entering the 9th. Let's bring that back. And what do you hope for in Zelda's next iteration of dungeons? Dungeons are my favorite part of Zelda games, and their last few entries have left me wanting. A game like Crosscode does a great job of mixing puzzles with combat within its dungeons. Make sure you understand a new powers application before it's given to you, and steadily ramps up the puzzles until they reach a final crescendo. Eventually, the puzzles grow to feature all your powers. It's actually really great, but it's not Zelda.